Okay, hello, everybody. Happy New Year. This is the first lecture of the 1916 Committee Lecture Series for 2021. There are a lot of people on this meeting, and I know some people aren't familiar with us, so I'll just do a brief introduction here. The 1916 Committee is formally known as Ireland's Easter Rising of 1916 Centennial Remembrance Committee of Rhode Island. That's the Facebook page. It's a brilliant page, which is run by George Doyle. Anybody who wants the specific name can send in a chat or a request email with the invitation you got today, and I'll get you the information. The committee was formed in 2014 in preparation for the 100th anniversary of the Easter Rising in Dublin. Over the course of the 2 years, we raised funds, we had lectures, we had dances, concerts, and we raised enough money to build a monument to the heroes of 1916. But at that time, we realized that the Brexit movement in England had changed the dynamics of the relationship with Ireland. And it created the possibility for a united Ireland, something that seems more and more possible. We'll hear a little more about Brexit later on in the night. Over the years, the 1916 Committee has had many great speakers and topics. We've had historians with PhDs explaining Irish revolutionary history, Irish cultural movements, as well as the contributions of Irish Americans to this country. Other times we have had committee members describe their own family's migration to this country and state. And tonight we will hear from another volunteer who has stepped up to continue our education. We will hear from Mavis McGetrick. She is not a historian nor a public speaker, but a true friend of Ireland. Mavis was a founding member of the Rhode Island unit of Irish Northern Aid and is a longtime activist for the reunification of Ireland. Mavis has given several other lectures over the years. Among them, in 2016, she gave a lecture on the women of 1916, along with Nancy Cray. In January of 2017, she told us about Bloody Sunday in Derry, 1972, when 13 unarmed civilians were murdered by British paratroopers, all of whom remain unpunished to this day. February 2018, she did a lecture, Kindred Spirits, the amazing story of the Choctaw Indians who raised money for the Irish famine victims and sent it across the ocean to Ireland. In January 2020, 1 year ago this month, she gave a lecture on the hunger, the voyage, and the welcome, which described the artist's journey that so many Irish men and women and children had leaving Ireland during the famine and the hostile welcome they received in North America. Tonight, Mavis is going to continue with a similar theme, speaking again on Irish immigration during the famine. The title of her lecture tonight is The Irish Girl and American Letters. Mavis will be accompanied by her niece, Carrie Reeves, who will give us a couple of songs. Here is a little bio on Carrie, self-described bio. Carrie Reeves is a singer who is passionate about music from a wide range of cultures and influences. Her love of Irish music comes from her mother's side of the family, who from an early age instilled in her a passionate love and loyalty to Ireland and the Boston Red Sox. Just a couple of housekeeping notes before we begin. We ask everyone to please keep muted for the length of the program. We will have a question and answer session at the end if anyone has questions, but we ask you to please use the chat box to ask questions. And at the end, the host will read the questions, and Mavis or whoever can answer them if that's necessary. So without further ado, Here is Mavis.
Thanks, Jimmy, and thanks everyone for logging in tonight for our talk on the Irish Girl and the American Letter. As Jimmy said, I'm certainly not an expert, a historian, a professor, anything like that, but I stumbled across this this information. I found it very interesting. I hope you do as well. Not only am I not an expert on the topic or history, I am not a Zoom or PowerPoint expert. So please be patient as we do some transitions throughout the presentation. As I'm sure you know, in the mid-1880s, a famine ravaged Ireland. The failure of the potato crop and the failure of the British government to provide relief had a catastrophic effect on the population of Ireland. Millions either died or emigrated. In the days of the hunger, there were two types of immigrants, voluntary and forced. The former, the voluntary immigrants, are considered those to have left Ireland of their own free will. Although it could be said that considering the state of affairs in Ireland at the time, they really had no choice. In contrast, forced immigration was a tactic used by the British to punish many people convicted of crimes during the famine. Now, to set the mood for the rest of the evening, let's listen to my niece, Carrie Reeves, sing a song about a man who was forced by the government to leave his home in Ireland for Australia. I'm sure many of you are familiar with the song.
By a lonely prison wall, I heard a young girl calling, Michael, they've taken you away, for you stole Trevelyan's corn, so the young might see the morn. Now a prison ship lies waiting in the bay. Low lie the fields of Athenry, where once we watched the small free birds fly. Our love was on the wing, we had dreams and songs to sing. It's so lonely around the fields of Athenry. By a lonely prison wall, I heard a young man calling, nothing matters, Mary, when you're free. Against the famine and the crown, I rebelled, they cut me down. Now you must raise our child with dignity. Low lie the fields of Athenry, where once we watched the small free birds fly. Our love was on the wing, we had dreams and songs to sing. It's so lonely round the fields of Athenry. By a lonely harbor wall, she watched the last star falling, as a prison ship sailed out against the sky. Sure, she'll live and hope and pray for her love in Botany Bay. It's so lonely round the field of Athenry. Low lie the fields of Athenry, where once we watched the small free birds fly. Our love was on the wing. We had dreams and songs to sing. It's so lonely around the fields of Athenry. Low lie the fields of Athenry, where once we watched the small free birds fly. Our love was on the wing. We had dreams and songs to sing. It's so lonely around the fields of Athenry.
Thanks, Carrie. And to quote what came in through the chat, that was lovely. And now on to the Irish Girl and the American Letter. I'm going to now put up a PowerPoint, so just give me a minute, please. Hopefully it's there. I would ask that tonight you keep in mind that here in the United States in the 21st century, we are dealing with many of the same issues that the Irish immigrants faced when they arrived here in the 19th century. We still have not figured it out. The written missive had remarkable significance for transatlantic migration. Indeed, the peopling of North America owed more than a little to a letter, specifically what was called the American Letter, written or sometimes dictated by millions of immigrants to their families and friends at home. Throughout the long history of migration to the United States, the American Letter played a crucial role in the lives of countless immigrants, as well as to the families and friends left behind. The letter home delivered news to loved ones, afforded an outlet for emotions, encouraged new migration through descriptions of the good life in America, and offered instruction on how intending immigrants might join those who had gone ahead. The American Letter was the voice of experience from a strange but enticing land. The letter may also have contained cash, a bank draft, or a prepaid ticket with a plea that a relation or friend follow the writer's path to the new country. In short, the American Letter was an essential part of the migration experience for people from many countries, but for no other group was it more important than for the Irish. Between 1854 and 1875, more than 60 million letters made their way from the United States to the United Kingdom. Authorities estimate that well over half of these were destined for Ireland. What has rarely been recognized is that most seem to have been written by young Irish women. Much of American Irish history has focused on the travails of the male Irish laborer, Paddy, in building the canals railroads, and roads, essentially laying the foundation of urban America. Less has been said about how the Irish girl, Bridget, contributed mightily to Irish emigration through her work as a domestic servant and as author of The American Letter, which had magnetic effects upon
Yeah,
family
listen,
and friends
some
in
people are
Ireland.
muted. Is there any way you can see who that is?
Why would the transatlantic letter be more important for the Irish than for other nationalities? One reason was timing.
I think it's Dan.
Irish immigration to America peaked in the wake of the Great Famine that devastated the old country, starting with the failure of the potato crop in the autumn of 1845. Over the next 10 years, more than 2 million Irish fled Ireland, with at least 60% of them going to America. They came during the sailing era, when crossing the Atlantic took 6 to 8 weeks, sometimes even longer.
Okay.
This is an illustration entitled Irish Immigrants Leaving Home, the Priest's Blessing. It appeared in the Illustrated London News on May 10th, 1851. It shows friends, neighbors, and the parish priest gathered to say goodbye to one of their own, leaving for the shores of America. For most, the passage was irreversible, giving rise to a practice called the American wake, a farewell touched with tears of mourning because it was likely to be the last. The best view of Ireland, the saying went, was from the back of a departing ship, and most of those who departed would never see the Irish coast again. This is an illustration of an emigrant ship leaving Liverpool, surrounded by those who will board and those who will be left behind. This irreversible crossing was not the case for immigrants who would come to America from other countries in later decades. By the 1880s, the steamship had become the dominant mode of transport, reducing the Atlantic voyage to 2 weeks or less. The steamer also decreased the cost and eased the hardship of passage, ushering in the so-called Great Wave of Immigration, which was 1880 to 1924, when many of the immigrants were birds of passage, men who came and went as migratory laborers. Demographers estimate that some 50% of Italians went back to their home country. By contrast, only 5 to 10% of Irish immigrants ever returned home. The Irish were permanent. If absence makes the heart grow fonder, then permanent absence nurtured among the exiles at Erin a profound longing for the old country expressed in countless ballads and poems. It also nurtured a formidable correspondence between America and Ireland. A second reason the American letter had such significance for the Irish was that the average Irish immigrant could read and write. Although they generally came from poor farming families, many had the rudiments of literacy, especially in comparison to immigrants from the continent. In Ireland, both the traditional hedge schools and the national schools, which opened in 1831, emphasized literacy. During the 19th century, the percentage of Irish with basic skills in reading and writing rose from around 30% in the 1830s to 75% by mid-century, culminating in a rate of 97% in 1900, higher than for the general American population. These averages tended to be highest among the young, and most immigrants were young. Here we have a photograph of women on a ship as it approaches New York City. The photograph is from the Museum of the City of New York. The third reason for the prominence
Watch
of
if you
letter
want, Bill.
was the unusually high percentage of women among Irish immigrants, especially young single women, the Irish girl. While men may have formed the emigration vanguard during the height
This
of the
is for me. Tell her I'm on.
women, most younger than 25 and many in their teens, represented a larger portion of migrants than for any other national group. In some decades, Irish female immigrants outnumbered males. On the eve of the American Civil War, for example, women made up half of all foreign-born Irish, a share that was to increase as the century wore on in what historians have called the feminization of the Irish diaspora. This modest imbalance in favor of women, combined with the occupational circumstances of both sexes, helped ensure that women would be responsible for a large share of Irish letters from America, to America, sorry. One of the ironies of 19th century Irish immigration was that on coming to America, the almost wholly rural Irish, scorned as dirt diggers and bog trotters, became city dwellers. Together with German newcomers, the Irish dominated immigrant arrivals through much of the 19th century. By 1870, the two groups represented a full 70% of the foreign-born population. Unlike the Germans, who favored farming and dispersed into the nation's heartland, the Irish clustered on the eastern seaboard, where they made up at least a quarter of the population in New York and Boston. Although the men abandoned farming, they did not relinquish the spade. This slide shows Irish immigrant men working on the Transcontinental Railroad in Utah. The photo is from the Utah Historical Markers website. As an aside, on March 17, 1996, the Hibernian Society of Utah erected a marker with the following text: "To the Irish who toiled on the Transcontinental Railroad, uniting our nation." They quickly took up backbreaking physical labor. In 1837, the North American Review observed that American laborers resented the Irish because they do more work for less money. And like today's Mexicans, the Irish took jobs native-born workers did not want. By the 1850s, they had constructed the great majority of America's public works, doing the bulk of the labor on the young nation's canals, roads, and rail lines. Despite the obvious value of the Irishman's brawn, Irish women found jobs even more readily than did Irish men. Quote, "The demand for females appears to be everywhere greater and more uniform than that for males," end quote, wrote the Anglo-Irish philanthropist Vere Foster in 1855. By far, the most important source of employment for Irish women was domestic service, most commonly as the maid of all work in the households of America's burgeoning gentry. As early as 1860, more than 3/4 of working Irish women were employed as domestics, a share that would vary little through the end of the century. Employers would have preferred to hire American girls. Help wanted notices routinely stipulated preference for Protestant or American candidates. Complaints about the raw Irish girl and jokes about Hibernian ineptitude were staples of women's publications. But for American girls, particularly those in cities, domestic service bore a social stigma. They considered the work profoundly demeaning. preferring jobs as shop girls, mill hands, seamstresses, and the like. Most any other form of work would do, even though it paid less and offered fewer opportunities to save. As for girls from other countries, few came unattached to husband or family, and cultural prescriptions discouraged them from living in strangers' households. During the American Civil War, a travel writer observed, vast numbers of Irish girls had found employment as servants in families. Here we have a picture showing a group of young Irish women domestic workers. This comes from the County Mayo Library website, and the women are believed to be from, and the picture taken, in New England. The numbers were indeed vast, particularly in the largest cities. In New York, Irish-born accounted for 23,386, or 80% of the city's 29,470 domestics in 1855. While no other city compared, by the end of the 19th century, so after the Civil War, 346 women of Irish stock, immigrants, and their children worked as domestics nationally, which was just under 50% of the total. These statistics do not take into account the number of African Americans who still held the positions in the former slaveholding states, a statement that can illustrate the type of work the Irish girl found herself doing in her new homeland. The contrasting opportunities available to Irish men and women led to markedly different working lives. The physical hardships of the Irish pick and shovel man have become part of American law. Their hours were long, the work backbreaking, the dangers from accident and disease many. As the male Irish laborer was risking his life, the Irish housemaid was working a grueling schedule, one that required, according to an expert of the time, the temperament of a saint and the constitution of a cowboy. If she were the only servant in the household, as was commonly the case, she would be first to rise every morning to light the fires and last to bed at night, fires banked and the household set in order. She typically worked 6 days a week and was on call throughout the night. She had 2 half days off, Sunday afternoon and Thursday evening. In comparison to the male Irish worker, her labor may not have been as dangerous, and her surroundings were certainly more genteel, but the work was physically demanding. Virginia Penny, 19th century America's foremost authority on women in the economy, put it concisely, quote, "Most maids of all work are Irish because most Irish can perform hard work," end quote. Even in a household where the mistress deigned to cook, an Irish girl was often retained for the heaviest labor. Sleeping in an alcove, a small room in the attic, or off the kitchen, the maid had little privacy. Still, living in provided advantages to the unattached Irish girl far from home. Her wages may have been meager, usually less than $4 a week, but her employer provided food, lodging, and a uniform, so her expenses were few. Domestic service offered opportunities to economize that were rarely available in other jobs. Indeed, many Irish girls said that this is what drew them to the work. If the ability to put aside her earnings was for the Irish female the job's chief attraction, then its major drawback was what one maid referred to as the awful lonesomeness. Writing in 1887, social reformer Helen Campbell evoked this feeling from a young Irish girl who had abandoned domestic work after only 1 year. Quote, "Ladies wonder how their girls can complain of loneliness in a house full of people, but oh, it is the worst kind of loneliness. Their share is but the work of the house. They do not share in the pleasures and delights of a home. One must remember that there is a difference between a house, a place of shelter, and a home, the place where all your affections are centered." End quote. In the 1881 book entitled The Servant Girl Question, an extended reflection on the relationship between mistress and maid, the popular essayist, novelist, and poet Harriet Spofford depicted the Irish domestic as a Cinderella without a fairy godmother. She expressed admiration for the young women who toiled from dawn until dead of night amid cheerful, carefree family life from which they were usually excluded. This exclusion was part of an emerging social protocol. In the years following the American Civil War, Uncle Tom's Cabin author Harriet Beecher Stowe became a Martha Stewart-like figure to American homemakers. She collaborated with her sister on an influential series of domestic guides, which urged the American mistress to keep a proper distance from the Irish servant. Employment agency staff who placed Irish domestics in American households made a point of warning the girls not to expect to become part of the family. One popular writer of the day expressed her disbelief that any intelligent American woman should be willing to consort with low and ignorant foreigners in the first place. Is it any surprise then that the Irish girl would strive to recreate in America the home life she had in Ireland? And so, while Irish men worked in labor gangs apart from town life, their female kin toiled amid genteel, if sometimes chilly, domesticity. Both Bridget and Patty must have experienced a sense of social isolation that would prompt the urge to write home. How men found the time, energy, or conditions under which to write is difficult to imagine. It is easier to envision the Irish girl alone in her room at the end of the day, putting pen to paper before turning to bed. By most accounts, she was a more prolific correspondent than her male kin. What can we say about the letters they wrote? The first thing to note is their sheer volume. As early as the 1830s, the Irish of New York alone were sending through Liverpool 300,000 letters per year. This was 11 times the number they received in return. When the famine struck, the numbers rose dramatically. An American missionary touring the Irish countryside in 1847 observed the utter astonishment of the postmasters in handling the huge flow of incoming mail. By 1854, the United States Postmaster General estimated that more than 2 million letters had been sent to the United Kingdom that year, the bulk of them to Ireland. 20 years later, so 1874, the figure had climbed to more than 6 million per year. And this is a photo of two girls outside a thatched cottage in County Monaghan, one reading the letter to the other. This comes from a Library of Congress collection called Letters from America. As for the messages the letters bore, many expressed a nostalgia for the life left behind. Letters also reflected deep concern for those who remained at home, a concern expressed tangibly through remittances. By mid-century, the Irish journalist and politician John F. Maguire would claim that the great ambition of the Irish girl is to send something to her people as soon as possible after she has landed in America. That something, of course, was money. Indeed, the Irish at home often said that what was in the letter was more important than what it said. The terms money letter, American letter, and Yankee letter were virtually synonymous. The Irish-born New England essayist Henry Giles observed in an antique turn of phrase that, quote, the mails come burdened with rudely directed letters, and all the many contain remittances, end quote. If all the many remittances did not come from women, then most did. While men included money with their letters, women were singled out for contributing what one historian called the lioness's share of money sent home, a portion estimated at 80% in 1861. No wonder then that one Protestant head of a Massachusetts household lamented what he considered the inflated wage he paid his Irish help and complained, "It is really we who are paying the rents over there." He was not far wrong. Through what could be squeezed from earnings, the immigrant helped family pay rent, buy food, supplement a sister's dowry, support a brother's education, and otherwise assist cash-strapped loved ones. But rather than simply sustain kin in the old country, many young women sought to reunite with family in America. Writing about 19th century Irish domestics, Hasia Diner cites sibling solidarity as a powerful motivation in reuniting families, noting, it was as though Irish migrants sought to recreate what they felt were the best and most meaningful elements of their childhood families. For some immigrant groups, family migration was the norm. The Germans, for example, came to America in varied combinations as intact families, church congregations, even entire villages in colonization schemes. The Irish were too poor for such collective movement. They came as families primarily when assisted, especially during the worst of the famine, when landlords paid passage for tenants, evicting them en masse, as the Marquis of Lansdowne had done his tenants, so that the land they occupied might more easily be converted to pasture. After the famine, the Irish tended to come in ones and twos, pioneering what is today called chain migration, a term we have heard a great deal about in recent years, which is the tendency of immigrants to follow family, friends, and neighbors to a new home. Yet the Irish did not so much follow kin as they brought them out. In fact, to bring out or to bring over was the term used to describe the process of emigration, even in Ireland, indicating a curiously American point of view, understandable when we recognize that much of the impetus for the post-famine exodus, especially the wherewithal, came from the Americas. Even before the famine, anecdotal murmurings about this unexpected wherewithal had begun to circulate among clerks and shipping agents in the banks and mercantile houses of New York, Boston, and Philadelphia. In 1838, the Irish-American publisher Matthew Carey declared, "Cases have fallen under my observation of Irish female domestics earning $1.25 per week, yet saving enough to pay the passages of brothers and sisters, one after another in succession." Ever the proud Hibernian, Carey was thrilled by these reports. But he may also have felt a twinge of embarrassment. Only 5 years earlier, he had been chiding wealthy Americans for their indifference toward the working poor, most of them Irish. He had argued that the immigrants could hardly survive on the wages they earned. How could these same impoverished Irish now be sending home, in his own words, an incredible amount of money, end quote? In his advocate's zeal, had Carey exaggerated the plight of the working poor? It was only natural that the intellectual Carey would dig deeper than the questionable accounts crossing his desk. He began, in the fashion of a Victorian scholar, by writing letters to officials of the banks most heavily used by immigrants, sending queries to 25 institutions. 5 responded, revealing that for the years 1835 and 1836, their depositors had sent to Ireland a total of nearly $315,000. Based on further discussions with the banks and belated returns of his survey, Carey estimated that for the 2-year period, remittances to Ireland had exceeded $800,000. Of course, this sum was drawn from the banks in a multitude of small drafts. So small and frequent were the withdrawals, less than $25 was typical, that a Philadelphia banker called them troublesome and implied that they were hardly worth the effort. Over the next several years, evidence mounted for a massive accumulation of funds sent to Ireland in small drafts. It was not long before persons in other quarters began to note these remittances with more than mere surprise. In 1847, Robert Murray, a Scotsman who headed the Provincial Bank of Ireland, expressed astonishment at the extent of the amounts his institution had processed the year before, the worst year of the famine. The remittances from Irish immigrants in America have been annually increasing for the past 10 years, Murray observed, until they have attained their present number and amount, which he estimated at $725,000. That amount included was large, powerfully large, and the equivalent of $21 million in today's dollars. Powerfully large seems to have been the understatement of an unsentimental Scotsman. Other commentators were more effusive, describing the aggregate transfers as phenomenal, breathtaking, and amazing. How did the significance of these transfers escape official notice for so long? Perhaps it was that the withdrawals were so small and that they were made by the most unprepossessing of customers, chiefly by girls in place, according to a journalist, John Francis Maguire, writing in 1868. This photo, again from the Library of Congress, shows Irish immigrants, and I hope you can see that many of them are indeed women, at the Immigrant Savings Bank in New York City. Bank clerks were sure to have remarked upon the increased traffic in December and March, for it was around Christmas and Easter, and maybe St. Patrick's Day, that the Catholic Irish were most intent on sending money home. It was then that their letters came in droves. Staff must have struggled to understand the thick brogues. They must also have struggled under the tedium of drawing up so many small drafts. Yet, would even the most insightful clerk have understood that these petty transactions were adding up to prodigious sums? Only at a higher level, in the counting room when tallies were made at the end of the day or weekly sales calculated, would some sharp-eyed accountant have noticed and remarked on these impressive amounts being transferred to Ireland. That these amounts came from poor Irish, especially poor Irish women, may have accounted for the delayed reaction. After all, to some, saving money was not considered an Irish virtue. Yet, as the sums sent to Ireland make clear, saving was a virtue for many immigrants, even among the poorest. In 1849, Earl Grey, Great Britain's Secretary of War in the colonies, and I suppose he was a tea drinker, requested an accounting of the remittances for the previous year. Thereafter, the British Colonial Land and Emigration Commissioners systematically gathered this information and published annual estimates of the sums coming from North America. The yearly totals continued to climb from $2.3 million in 1848 to $8.7 million in 1854, a peak year for the famine emigration. Throughout the remainder of the 1850s, even as the worst effects of the famine eased, the American letter remained the major source of support for Irish poor. All in all, the saying in Ireland that women could be great hoarders of small coins also applied in America. Rather than secreting coins in the thatch, as was their habit in the old country, women banked their meager earnings until they could send them to relatives and friends, along with entreaties that others hastened to join them. If money in the American letter was an eloquent argument for emigration, the enclosure of a prepaid ticket was even more persuasive. During the latter half of the 19th century, more than 40% of all remittances came in the form of prepaid tickets, and American money would pay for 3/4 of all Irish emigration. Again, historians have observed that the millions that poured into Ireland came primarily from single women. Once married, these women tended to send less home, and yet the Irish were noted for delaying marriage or foregoing it altogether. By the time they were ready to marry, many had fulfilled obligations to kin at home and taken on new responsibilities to husbands and children in America. They had been joined by family who would shoulder the now shared burden of remittances home. Of those who remained single, and their numbers were large, many continued to bring out kin. It was precisely this expansive sense of family feeling that kept in motion the stream of immigrants that swept America's shores and the tide of remittances that flowed back to Ireland. Although remittances would drop during the American Civil War years of 1861 to 1865, when immigration briefly faltered, they would pick up again after the United States and Great Britain enacted an International Money Order Convention in 1871, ensuring that money transfers would remain a driving force for immigration through the rest of the century. When Ireland suffered a new period of agricultural crisis in 1880, the habit of emigration had become part of the national ethos. Departures were fewer than in the years immediately after the Great Famine because the suffering was less, but Ireland was a much smaller country, its population having dropped from a pre-famine high of 8.5 million to 4.4 million by century's end. Nearly 3 million had departed, most for North America. Ireland's rate of emigration was higher than for any other country in Europe. Historian Dennis Clark characterized the remittances that financed so much of this immigration as, quote, the greatest transatlantic philanthropy of the 19th century, end quote. In strict monetary terms, the sums were truly remarkable. From the Great Famine through the end of the 19th century, known transfers exceeded $260 million, the equivalent of almost $8 billion with a B dollars today. This figure was greater than the Irish government relief for the period. It also dwarfed the sums sent home by Germans, the largest immigrant group at the time. In some years, the figure even exceeded the annual budget of the United States Navy, as one immigration critic complained. Remittances did much to relieve poverty in Ireland, mostly by paying rents, debts, and taxes. But their greatest impact was upon migration itself. The Irish said, emigration begets emigration. Their system of one bringing another had become self-perpetuating, as the pioneering migrant was joined by a sister, brother, or other close relative, who then took a job and chipped in, the family working as a team to pool savings and send for cousins, in-laws, and friends. In this way, many poor Irish girls became anchors in chains of migrants that would ground Irish American neighborhoods, parishes, and political wards, institutions that helped ensure a safe landing for new arrivals. No other country's immigrants included so large a share of women. But the pivotal role the Irish girl played in building the Irish American community has been overshadowed by the labors of her kinsman, Patty, who dug the canals, laid the tracks, and carried the vote. Bridget, the maid of all work and brunt of Yankee humor, has yet to be fully recognized for her outsized contribution to Irish immigration. Ever mindful of the kin from whom she departed, with the discipline and frugality that was near Calvinist in nature, the lowly Irish domestic sought to support family in the old country and to make for them a new home in America. If emigration from Ireland was an exodus, as native-born Americans often called it, then Bridget was its Moses. Moses directed his people with the staff. Bridget led hers with a pen. And now to wrap it up, I'm going to throw it back, I hope, to Carrie for another song. Okay, we're having a...
There it is.
There it is.
Thanks, Mavis. Wow, Mavis, you're an amazing writer. I hope that maybe all of these things that everybody's sharing, maybe they can be published or at least compiled, because that was so good. And it's not scripted that I was going to say that, so I'm compelled. This next song that I'm going to sing is called Galway Bay. It's the less popular of the two popular Galway Bay songs. And it is a song about immigration in that it was written from the perspective of somebody who had immigrated and was feeling nostalgia for the homeland. And I was talking about it with Mavis, and I said, is the word really nostalgia? And she said, I think it's yearning. And that's absolutely, I agree with that. So without further ado, Galway Bay. 'Tis far away I am today from scenes I roamed a boy. And long ago, the hour I know I first saw Illinois. But time nor tide nor waters wide could wean my heart away. Forever true, it flies to you, my own dear Galway Bay. Both gray and bleak by shore and creek, the rugged rocks abound. But sweet and green the grass between that grows on Irish ground. Friendship fond, all else abound, and love that lives always. Bless every home beside your foam, my own dear Galway Bay. Had I used blood and hopeful mood and heart of fire once more, for all the gold that I might might hold. I'd never leave your shore. I'd live content with whatever God sent, midst neighbors old and gray. And I lay my bones 'neath churchyard stones beside you, Galway Bay. The blessings of a poor old man be with you night and day. The blessings of a lonely man whose heart will soon be clay. That's all the heaven I ask of God upon my dying day. My soul to soar forevermore above you, Galway Bay.
Thank you very much, Carrie. I'm sure we'll be hearing more from you in the future. First of all, let me say that my face looks like this because I tripped in a pothole. That's not a joke. It happened, but I'm fine. We are still advocating with the American Brexit Committee. We recently sent the most updated information regarding Britain's long history of destabilization actions in Northern Ireland to our reps in DC. That's something we like to do a lot of. If anybody's interested, I have all their addresses and we have the letters. You don't have to write up your own letters. Legacy investigations are being the prominent issue today. The ALOH last week had a presentation on that was very informative, and if you look on YouTube, you can find it. About it had two families that lost their loved ones, and it hasn't been resolved. And I just can't imagine how hard that is for people to not get a resolution to the loss of a family member. A letter has been sent to the new Secretary of State, Anthony Blinken, reiterating this issue that's been ignored so long, as well as reminding him of the significance of the foreign policy achievements that were created by President Clinton and Speaker O'Neill. Those policies were created to overturn the bullying and stonewalling of peace efforts by the British. We will continue to reinforce the commitment to put into effect all the obligations of the Good Friday Agreement, including a unity polling and unity referendum. Again, if there's any questions, if you want to put them into the chat, and I'll make sure that Mavis gets them. If not, we can also email you the answer to your question. Thank you.
Okay. Again, thank you, Mavis. Thank you, Carrie. And just to wind up here, on behalf of the 1916 committee, I certainly thank everyone who came tonight. I hope you stay with us in the future. Here is a little bit of information about some upcoming events. We are no longer tied to the last Friday night in every month because we're not doing in-person events. So we're going to have a change in February. We have a completely different event for you to look forward to. We're going to be having a speaker from Ireland. Thanks to the efforts of Mike Cannon and Marie McGee, we will hear from Karen Quinn, who is the representative of Friends of Sinn Féin in North America. Karen grew up in Belfast during the 70s and 80s and has much firsthand experience with British oppression on the streets of Belfast, and he'll certainly be making reference to that. But his speech is going to be more geared towards educating us here in Rhode Island about the current situation in Ireland today. He'll certainly talk about Brexit and the ramifications on the ground of day to day. It is not going very smoothly in either the 26 or the 6 counties. And Karen will speak to us at length about Sinn Féin's plans for the reunification of Ireland. Also, please understand that there'll be ample time for questions and answers next month when this takes place. So please set aside the date. It's February 13th, a Saturday. It's going to take place at 11 a.m. East Coast time because of the time difference and what Karen's schedule is. So please save that date. Invitations will go out from the committee and from Marie with the Zoom information that you need. In March, we don't have any lecture scheduled at this point. So suggestions and volunteers are always welcome. All you got to do is say that you're interested and we'll be happy to accept you. In April, on April 5th, we're going to have our annual Easter Monday commemoration. Of course, it will be held on Zoom. We will have some speakers commenting on the importance of that week in Dublin. Tom Kelly will read the proclamation and Sean Connell will perform several appropriate songs. Now, in May, we're really gearing up for this. We're all looking forward to the commemorating the 40th anniversary of the Irish hunger strike, when in 1981, 10 brave Irishmen gave their lives fighting for the right to be recognized as political prisoners. The 1916 committee will be joining together with many other organizations, both local and international, to acknowledge one of the most important events in Irish history. Here is just one of the current ideas that are things that are being planned. This comes from Marty Glennon, a longtime activist for Irish causes and a member of many current Irish organizations. And this is what he emailed to us. Many of you have heard that we are in the middle of preparing a global commemoration for the 40th anniversary of Bobby Sands' death after 66 days on hunger strike. And as you are more than likely aware, while in Long Kesh prison, Bobby wrote the song Back Home in Derry. We thought, what better way to commemorate his legacy than to ask musicians from around the world to sing, quote, in unison. I don't know how many people have seen Playing for Change on YouTube, which is an international effort. And this is what they're going to do for the song that Bobby wrote. 40 years ago this May, the world mourned the death of Bobby Sands, including many world leaders. What better way to spread Bobby's message for Irish unity than to let everyone know that we are on the precipice of a united Ireland and that Bobby and his 9 comrades did not die in vain. And he ends with this quote, "Our revenge will be the laughter of our children." Bobby Sands. That's from Bobby Sands. We will keep you informed about all this information through our emails. In June, there is nothing scheduled yet, but let's hope by then we will all be vaccinated and we can skip the lecture, skip the speech, and all meet at the Cayley Club and have a rip-roaring session with Sean Connell, Colm O'Brien, Bob Druin, Kevin Doyle, Maureen Doyle, all the crowd from the musicians at Patrick's Pub in the Galway Bay, and take the roof off of the place and get together once again the way we always were supposed to. Now, to get in touch with us, you can respond to the email invitation, whether it came from the 1916 committee or from Marie McGee, and we will get back to you, put you on our mailing list. And in conclusion, just to say again, to repeat some of the things that are being in the chat box here. Great job, Mavis. Great job, Carrie. We keep doing it. Let's keep doing it. And in February, we'll be listening to a speaker from Ireland, okay?
And we also want to thank Ron for being our technical Zoom director.
Very good. I meant to say that.
Okay, are we going to go back to Marie now for question and answers? Are we all done?
No,
Back to Marie.
back to Marie.
Okay. I just have to find her here. All right, Marie, it's
Now
up to you.
So if anybody, I don't see any questions in the chat box, but if anybody wants to pipe up and ask a question, Mavis is here, and not only Mavis can answer questions, maybe somebody else can answer a question too. And amongst the musicians that we would like to see when we get off this coronavirus will be Carrie, who really, what a magnificent voice. And it was so nice to hear you for the first time. Really nice. Thank you so much. Going once. Mavis, are there any materials about Rhode Island?
Not that I came across in researching this. But we know there were, someone put in the chat that their mother worked as a domestic.
Yes. Was there like a lot of thievery with the postal service when they found out that the money was in those
Of course
envelopes?
not. Jane Larson is here. There was absolutely no thievery, right, Jane?
Yeah, that's true.
Well, I know my grandmother did the same thing, and then my mother did it. And when we went over in 1969, there was one relative remaining alive and thanked us for the money that had come over for many,
no.
probably about 70 years at that point.
Hey, I'm not running this thing, but I think if anybody wants to unmute and say hello to someone or say anything else, I mean, there's a lot of people, but there might be some cross-talking, but you can unmute now. We're freeing you.
Hi, all New York, Scanlon and Brandon cousins. Great to see you.
Thanks for coming.